Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the New Liar podcast. I'm your host, David Goslin, and with me today, we have a special guest, former Poet Laureate of California, Dana Gioia. Dana, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. And I mean, there are many ways that we could introduce you. You are a veteran, poetry veteran. You are the former chairman of the National Endowments for the Arts, former Poet Laureate of California, critic, librettist, translator, right? I recently read your great translation of Seneca's The Madness of Hercules. So, yeah, you've really gone full spectrum, and it's nice to see somebody covering all the bases today. So yeah, I mean, we could introduce you in all sorts of ways, but I think actually a decent title would be the modern Solon of poetry. And I will justify that later on. But I'll just say that I think, you're someone who's firmly rooted in the Western classical tradition. And at the same time, I think part of that tradition, especially among poets, has always been to also uh, have a spirit of reform, right? If we think of Homer, if we think of Dante, they were very much in touch with their past, their heritage, their traditions, but they were also reformers, right? Their poems were were doing a lot, and this is something that you talk about, right? Sort of getting back to the basics in terms of poetry's origins and function. So this conversation is going to go all over the place, but maybe just to zoom out and for people who've maybe never heard you and the many poetry soapboxes that you have, maybe give us a little taste of how you're thinking about how you've been thinking about poetry and yeah, where your mind's at these days.
Well, let me introduce myself briefly. I am a working class kid from Los Angeles, first person in my family ever to go to college. My mother was Mexican. My dad was Sicilian. She worked at the phone company. My dad was a cab driver, a chauffeur, a department store salesman. He went through a number of jobs. And we lived in a fairly rough neighborhood in Los Angeles. But at an early age, I recognized that I was different from the other kids. I was drawn to things that they weren't. Now, that often sounds like the beginning of a homosexual narrative, where you say, well, I realized I was different from the other boys, but I did realize I was different from the other boys, not because of my sexuality, but because I was drawn to beauty. I would hear a piece of classical music and it would ravish me. My mother, who didn't have much education, but loved poetry, would recite a poem and it would affect me deeply. And I knew fairly early on that although I wasn't sure about anything in my life because there were no models available to me, basically I was surrounded by immigrants who had had very tough lives, who were barely eking out an existence. But I knew that my life would take in some way a different form than theirs did. First, I thought it was to music, but eventually it ended up to be poetry. I've never lost touch with my roots or the people I came from. Uh, and so I'm a puzzle to American intellectuals. I don't behave the way an intellectual, an artist should. Um, you're supposed to, in some ways, go off to Stanford and Harvard, which are the schools that educated me, and go through a conversion experience where you throw away your past and you enter joyfully and gratefully into a kind of elite class of intellectuals. I enjoyed visiting those places, but I never wanted to live there. I'm a person deeply rooted in traditions in every sense of the word, literary traditions, religious traditions, family traditions, the rare and vanishing tradition of feeling a deep identification with the place in which I was raised, which in my case was California. So I've been a puzzle to other people. And indeed, David, I've been a puzzle to myself.
Hmm. I mean, when it comes to poets, right, you actually it seems like there's a common theme here of I was different actually. So it's this is a recurring theme the more and more we speak with poets. And I mean that you just said right at the beginning though, something you were different because there was beauty had this special appeal and you were drawn to it. And I do like to and there's a lot there, right? What does that even mean? Why? And I think of beauty as an invitation, right? Because you always have surface beauty, you have beautiful forms, poetry has beautiful language, but it doesn't really stop there, right? It's usually an invitation, but once we go further, we discover all sorts of other things. And you
Absolutely.
talk,
And you're asking exactly the right questions. Um, what puzzled me, and it puzzled me not only while I was at Harvard and Stanford, but it puzzled me in subsequent years, was that I was surrounded by some of the best literary minds of my time. At Harvard, I had Robert Fitzgerald, the great translator of Sophocles, Homer, Virgil. I had Elizabeth Bishop, now perhaps the preeminent American poet of the later half of the 20th century. I was studied with great theorists, some of whom I was very taken with, like Harry Levin, and some of whom I was suspicious of even then, like Edward Said. Robert Lowell was in the department. Octavio Paz was in the department. And so these were tremendous minds. But what puzzled me was that we never talked about what I would think of as the fundamental things. We never talked about beauty. Beauty, if to the degree it was mentioned, people would wince.
hmm,
Uh, with some illusion of the past. Nobody ever, we talked about all sorts of things about poetry, but nobody was ever tried to define it, or more importantly, explain or explore why do human beings need poetry? What are the human purposes of the art? And so I had in my university education, I was studying eventually to be a PhD at Harvard, and I just decided, although I adored graduate study, nothing could make me happier than spending a day in the library, uh, except maybe when I was that age to spend my time with a beautiful woman. I was lucky to marry one. I've been married for 44 years, and so uh, that life took care of that. But I still miss the fantastic intellectual life of Harvard. But I decided to leave because I felt it was bad for me as a poet and as a critic. And my ambition, and I don't know if are Canadians embarrassed by ambition, David?
no, we're just nice folks, we don't want any trouble. That's
Because the British are trouble. The British think the Americans are terribly vulgar because we say, well, I want to go out and do this and that, and I want to have a big life, and they feel like that's an American vice, that we're being crude about it. But I was an ambitious person. I did not want the lives that my parents and grandparents had lived, often in extreme poverty. I loved them. I never wanted to cut off any of my ties with my family, but I did not want the life that they had. I wanted a big life. I wanted to be able to live in different places. I wanted to read things. I wanted to go to the great museums. I wanted to hear operas in the great opera houses. I wanted to travel. And you can say, well, Dana, those are vulgar and material ambitions, but well, I'm sorry, maybe they are, but I had them.
Mm,
And so and I felt, that the the key ambition I really had was to be the best poet and the best critic that I could possibly be. And although in theory I was in the very best place you could possibly be to do that, Harvard University, Stanford University, the Ivy League, it struck me as that I was being, in a genteel and sophisticated way, being led astray. Uh, Not into badness, but into kind of a circular world of self-reference. Uh, that I was being trained, and I was being trained very well to write poetry and to speak about poetry in a way that perhaps 700 people in the United States could understand.
mm,
And those people would be the people who governed the success of my career. Let's be generous. Let's say it was 1,000 people could understand. But I didn't want to write for 1,000 professors. I wanted, and this is a terrible, embarrassing, vulgar American ambition. I wanted to write for everyone. I
mm.
wanted to write in a way that, I mean, not everyone's probably the wrong thing to say, but I wanted to write in a way that the people I came from could understand, and the people I was studying with at Harvard could understand. Now, they might understand the poem differently, but I wanted to write a poem that was available, that was engaging to a broad and mixed audience. I
Mm.
didn't see the point otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons when I stumbled upon your work, it was an essay, I think, on first things. Right, actually, kind of funny story. It was your essay, Poetry and Christianity for First Things. I had been planning to submit, it was around Shelley, the 250th or 200th anniversary of Shelley's death or something. And I had an essay that I was working on. And I poked around different places, and that was one of the outlets, first things that I wanted to submit that one to, because I had read other articles that I liked. And then I saw your essay on poetry and Christianity, which touched on many similar themes in terms of poetry's role and things that Shelley had also talked about. So I was like, well, I mean, I don't think I should. I mean, there's no point of submitting the essay now. This thing kind of did everything one would I was planning to do basically, but and better. So in a sense, it was like, well, good. And so then I reached out to you, and yeah, that this idea, I watched your lecture on for the Library of Congress on poetry as enchantment, right? We have your book here, which is one of your latest books, which is a collection of essays, Poetry as Enchantment, and other essays. And one of the polemics that you threw out there, and that's what I really liked. You have a very nice, friendly approach, but you were throwing out all sorts of bombs, pretty much polemics about the role of literature and poetry. So I perked up right away. And one of them was that you said, I forget exactly how you said it, but the idea that the way to gauge the effectiveness or success of a poem isn't really by, you don't really judge it according to the opinions of the established literary critics so much as by the response of a general audience. You said something along those lines, and I agreed. I had been playing around with this idea of poetry around the campfire. If you get together with a bunch of people, all of you have never really met, maybe one friend and went camping or something, and there's 10 people around the campfire. What are you going to read? Including original poetry. If people take out their original poems, are we just going to hear, you know, existential poems about whatever, the first time you smoked pot with your dad or got abused or whatever? Or are we going to have a transcendent and transformative experience that everybody's going to resonate with, even if they don't fully understand everything or whatnot. They're going to be elevated, right? Something is going to turn on inside them, and there's going to be a magic around the campfire.
David, you're going through so many themes. I think we should pause and explore some of them.
Yeah.
We can start at the beginning, or we can start where you ended. But maybe I'll start at the beginning and to say that you reached out to me, and I was glad to engage you in conversation because I saw at once you were deeply serious about your commitment to poetry and to literature. You were immersing yourself and wrestling with great texts, and you were in some ways lost. And when I said when I left Harvard, I was lost too.
Hmm.
I had all this learning, I had this passion, I had this commitment to the art, but the training that I had been given was the training for a profession of teaching literature rather than a profession of creating and conversing with the great tradition. And so, it seemed to me that you needed to be engaged in a broader conversation, and that was one of the things I could do with my voice, but that you were doing everything seriously, and that's very rare today. Now, uh, that leads me into the one of the other things that you said, and you said it twice in different ways. And I don't think of myself as a polemical writer, although there have been occasions in my career where I've indulged in polemics. But I'm a writer who I think tries to talk to the reader as a complete human being. I try to talk to them intellectually, emotionally, uh, as an individual, as a citizen, as a reader, and all of these different identities. But I am, to use a terrible word, a reformer.
Hmm.
Uh, I think it may be a classier word to say I am a revisionist. When I was at Stanford and I was studying the 18th century uh, for the first time, I didn't have a lot of initial sympathy for the 18th century. I'd read Addison, I'd read Steele. These are the two Englishmen who literally invented what we think of today as a newspaper and what we think of today as an essay in English. The essay goes back to Seneca and Montaigne, so I'm not disputing its ancient heritage, but in English terms, they were people who developed the rhetoric of this prose style that we still use. And they constantly talked about themselves being reforming the taste of their time. And to me, I'm a Catholic, and so reformers sounds like it's going to be John Calvin breaking all the statues up and throwing rocks at the stained glass windows, or saying you can't drink, you can't do this, you can't do that. The way that American political reformers, are often. But I realized over time that they were talking about, and I mean this quite seriously, the eternal and unavoidable task of any critic, which is to engage the mistakes, the misconceptions, the platitudes of the time and correct them. And so I don't tend to write a big essay unless I'm disagreeing with something. Um, and indeed, many people have found me disagreeable because I tend to question the what James Fenton calls, and he's quoting actually Evil and Waugh, the ghastly good taste
Hmm.
of the times. And we live in an age where the official models of academic literature are are ghastly. There's a kind of taste that they occupy, and to try to reconcile uh, what's going on now with what we think of as are the right standards. And I just published a book, Poetry as Enchantment, in which I really disagree with the way that poetry is conceptualized in virtually all criticism and virtually all instruction. And I say, I'm going to offer a different definition of what poetry is and what poetry does and why it matters to people than what we're given or what people ignore even to talk about. Uh, and that's what animates the essay. Can poetry matter? I look at the American poetry culture and I make an observation. The observation is that at no point in human history has poetry been so richly subsidized as in America today. Now, Americans say, well, no, we don't get enough poetry, but the government spends billions of dollars every year in the United States. And I say this as somebody who is running the American uh, official arts agency. America spends billions of dollars every year in subsidizing poetry. We
Mm-hmm.
employ tens of thousands of people to profess poetry at universities and schools. We give grants to people who, through government money and private money, to go off and write poetry, to publish poetry, to give readings of poetry, to do films of poetry and broadcasts of poetry. There's never been an apparatus as exists in the United States. Now, Canada has done a lot of subsidy, but America is doing it on a huge scale compared even to the generosity of the Canada Arts Councils. Uh, and yet, in America, has there ever been a great culture, a great society in which poetry meant so little? And I said, well, that was a paradox I wanted to explore. Was there, in fact, a connection between how America supports poetry and the diminishment of poetry in American public culture? So I am a, a, a skeptical critic. I am a revisionist critic. You can say that, that in my certain moments I indulge in polemics, but what I'm trying to do is to get at, insofar as anyone can, the truth of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, I mean you kind of summed it up there. Your article, I think a lot of people, listeners, will have probably heard of it, Can Poetry Matters, from 1991, published in The Atlantic. And I was watching an interview you did where you just talked about the responses, right? I mean, people you had freakouts, right? You had all sorts of, which is fun, and I'm oftentimes, maybe that means you struck a nerve. I would like to read you a quote, on that note, that I think speaks to a similar thing that you're describing in terms of, the poetry having maybe lost its way, or whoever, maybe not poetry, but people who were supposed to be the curators and preservers of it. I have a quote by Schiller, and I would like to get your response. It touches on what you're talking about. So this is from his ninth letter on the aesthetic education of man. And he says, the artist, it is true, is the son of his age, but pity for him if he is its pupil, or even its favorite. Let some beneficent divinity snatch him when a suckling from the breast of his mother, and nurse him with the milk of a better time, that he may ripen to his full stature beneath a distant Grecian sky. And having grown to manhood, let him return, a foreign shape, into his century, not, however, to delight it by his presence, but terrible, like the son of Agamemnon, to purify it. The matter of his works he will take from the present, but their form he will derive from a nobler time. Nay, from beyond all time, from the absolute unchanging unity of his nature. Here, from the pure ether of his spiritual essence, flows down the fountain of beauty, uncontaminated by the pollutions of ages and generations, which roll to and fro in their turbid vortex far beneath it.
Well, David, one of the things that I love about you is your passion and knowledge of Friedrich Schiller, who is one of the great writers of modern European literature. And I think of him as in some ways the key figure of the German Enlightenment and its transition eventually into Romanticism, which he prefigures in his work. And the letters on the aesthetic education of men, it was something I was fortunate enough to study in German in college and then again in graduate school. And they have been really important texts for me for my whole career. And they're virtually unknown in the United States. Perhaps they're better known in Canada. I doubt it, though.
No.
I think you're actually sort of, one of the few people who are actively talking about him. But, what Schiller is writing out of Kant, which is a statement that most people won't even understand what I mean. But Kant is the first philosopher who, in modern terms, explains or demonstrates, in his case, because it's at the end of a great logical argument, that there is a kind of perception and experience of the world which is aesthetic, that is involved with beauty and the notion of beauty. It's a holistic knowledge versus a purely rational knowledge. And Schiller takes these Kantian insights, and in this enormously important series of letters, he talks about what the aesthetic sense is and why it is irreplaceable in human education and in human spiritual intellectual development. This is an argument which really has been fallen into abeyance, for all kinds of reasons in postmodern thought. And Schiller has never been terribly influential on English literature since people like Coleridge and the early Romantics. But when you look at that, you and I could take it in several directions. But let me take one direction, which refers to something you said before, which is traditionalist. Am I a traditionalist? And my answer is, I don't think so. I don't think I'm at all traditional in my writing, but I have immersed myself in a tradition. I love the tradition. I let the tradition lead me into what I think of as new creation. So I don't think my essays or my poems are a lot like anybody else's, but they could not have been created, without having been, as Schiller says, nurtured, by this tradition, by having had the aesthetic and the philosophical education of those who came before me. I think of literature as a conversation. It is a conversation, first of all, between people. You and I are having a conversation that's part of literary discourse in a general sense, but it's also a conversation between the living and the dead, between the past and the present, between masters and students. I was fortunate to study at Stanford and Harvard. I was far more fortunate to study with Dante and Shakespeare and Schiller and Coleridge and Auden and Eliot and Pound, and have these people help me form it. So at 2 a.m, if I need him, I can have a conversation with Dante. Now, this is not some kind of metaphor I'm saying for this, that it's absolutely true. I'll have a question and I'll go to the dead to converse with them about the answer for the question. I probably won't find the answer because we don't find the answer when we talk to people about these things. But if we have a really good conversation, they basically provoke us into figuring it out. And so uh, I think it is impossible for a writer to form himself or herself without engaging the dead, without engaging the tradition. Now, this terrifies people because they say, well, I can't read everything. I think you don't have to read everything. Nobody has read everything, but you need to have some ancestors that you engage, you read, you speak to, you argue with, you co-create yourself with. Just as that you don't create yourself, you're created by a long genetic line that expresses itself through your parents as a biological reality, as a cultural reality, as a familial personal reality. And it's the same thing in literature. Now,
Hmm.
you can call that traditionalism, but traditionalism is not servile imitation.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, yeah, people get hung up on these questions, right? There's a lot of terms, things become overdetermined, and you get these different tribal camps. So I do like to think about new ways of reconceptualizing the question. And I mean, even just hearing you speak, though, as Ecclesiastes, nothing new under the sun. Is that a traditionalist take? I mean, I think the usefulness of what you're describing, the dialogue with the ancients, with dead uh, poets and people, is that there are recurring themes. We're all mortals. We're all human beings. There's a human experience, and it helps to zoom out, right? And to see how different people struggle with similar questions, often, taking very different paths or doing something completely different than you would, but it's still useful to see
Yeah,
what happens, to see what they do. And that's how I see dialogue. I mean, that's how they're thought experiments as well, right? We have to be able to weigh different scenarios, play out different scenarios, and that requires a lot of creativity. Anybody who's going to chart a new path, you're still people who chart new paths usually rely on previous trailblazers. If we're talking about literary folks, we're talking about previous poets and writers. Doesn't mean they're going to write what they wrote, but there is that connection and this contrast between these questions, these recurring questions over time, is humbling, right? I feel that it does ground us, right? We become more firmly rooted and therefore confident in our ability to now problem solve in our age, right? That's why I love this Schiller quote. And I feel like you fit that description, even though you come across as a nice guy. And I'm sure you're a nice guy, but like you said, right, when you wrote This Can Poetry Matter, or when people hear you speak, uh, let's say people who are in the literary scene or in the academic scene, they can be a bit thrown by the things that you say. But this is exactly what Schiller's describing. And yeah, to do that though, right, to have this spirit of reform, it's actually you need two seemingly contradictory ideas, which is to have this firm rootedness in the past and tradition to kind of situate yourself, to know what's changed and to know what hasn't, right? Some things are eternal, some things are constant, and some things are changing.
yeah.
And
I mean, I'll give you a perfect example of tradition. I come from a family of four kids, uh, three guys and a girl. We all come from the same tradition, which is to say, my parents, and yet all four of us are unlike. We're recognizably different, yet we have similarities. And that's the same way that tradition operates, is that you have from the same sources, you find the means to express your individuality. Uh, the literary culture nowadays, is, and I'm sure it's always been a sorry affair, but in America, the United States, um, literary people that were bold and were original and were unconventional, and they all think alike. There's an enormous amount of conformism in the literary world. And especially, nowadays when there's all kinds of ideological arguments, people pretend to be more conformist than they really are because they're afraid of paying the price for nonconformism. Uh, and you see this when things change and people say, "Oh, I always hated that, but I didn't really want." And
Hmm.
so we have a very meek culture, and here, very conformist culture in literature, because literature has become institutionalized. People are all, huge number of poets are employed by the government or employed by, these, great private universities or not so great private universities, and they have to behave themselves in some way. So although they style themselves as revolutionaries, they're revolutionaries with a dental plan and a retirement fund that
Right.
they don't want to lose. Um, and the institutions in which we work mold and often determine our behavior. And that's one of the reasons that I really felt that I had to leave academic life, because I could see it's a very nice place to be. People were doing very good work. I think it was actually a much nicer place to be 50 years ago than it is today, and in its much diminished form, with literature enrollments falling off and English departments seeming marginal, even to great universities. But so people wanted to, they used common sense in managing their careers. But a writer must have his or her strongest commitment to truth, to saying what you think is truthful, even if it comes at a price. And I think that we've lost that. I think that what I've represented in American poetry criticism has been to articulate without anger, without, you could,
An axe to grind.
you know, uncomfortable truths, and that I make reasonable and in some cases irrefutable arguments that point out that there's a contradiction or hypocrisy or a paradox in parts of culture. I mean, when I published this piece many years ago, I don't know, 33 years ago or something, in the maybe longer, I don't know, yeah, about 33 years ago, I think, in the Atlantic Monthly, there was no email then. I mean, there was a few people that used this thing that we didn't really even recognize that was email, but it generated more mail than any article had done in the entire history of the Atlantic Monthly. And the Atlantic Monthly is one of the great American journals. It goes way back into the 19th century.
Hmm.
Uh, and this is when people actually had to write a letter. They had decided at the last minute not to put my article on the cover. So it wasn't even the cover article. It was just an article that people found in the Atlantic. And I got hundreds and hundreds of letters. Now, that was the first thing that was interesting, is that so many people were moved to write it. The more interesting thing was that usually if I'm going to write a letter, it's usually because I'm mad about something.
Right.
Almost all of the mail was positive. People said, oh, this is somebody who's finally making, thank you for this article. It's finally explaining what's going on in poetry to me. And I'd say only about 10% of these letters were negative. And so the first interesting thing, lots of mail. Second thing, uh, unusually, the mail was all positive. And third interesting thing was that, and I'm not exaggerating this, every letter that was negative was by somebody who self-identified themselves as being part of a creative writing program at a university, a student or a faculty member. So it's, so if you write an article about corruption in the police department, uh, and you're in Montreal, right?
Yeah.
In Montreal, and every citizen of Montreal who writes the paper says, yes, this corruption exists. And the only people that says it doesn't are members of the police department. I think you've got a pretty strong suspicion that the police department is corrupt. Not that I'm making any allegations about, I'm sure, the entirely honorable constabulary of Montreal, but it showed the fact that there were two visions in the United States of what was going on. One was held by the tiny sliver of people who were in creative writing departments, and the other was held by everyone else in the country. I got letters from ranchers, from lawyers, from judges, from soldiers, and they all felt. And so it showed, in a sense, how remote from the reality of people's lives. And so, as a critic, I've tried to, in a sense, speak truthfully and carefully to study things and write as well as I possibly can. I try to write my essays with my full equipment as a writer. When I was younger, I wrote them very intellectually, but after a while, I wrote them the same way that I write my poems, which is to say, taking into account emotion, imagination, intuition, and make the prose itself rich with meaning.
Mm.
Now, as a poet, what I've represented is a kind of independent course. When nobody was supposed to write in rhyme and meter, I wrote in rhyme and meter. When no one was supposed to write narratives in verse, I began to write long narratives. By long, I mean the length of a short story, not book length narrative. And then even more annoyingly, I also wrote in free verse. I did not have a predetermined ideology of what poetry should be. I let each poem dictate its own means of expression. I tried to make myself available. So the free verse establishment went nuts because rhyme and meter were supposed to be dead. And here's, this fellow leading a group of people that were reviving it. So I was reviled. I mean, I became famous, David, because so many people attacked me. And then so many people defended me. But within the formalist community of these people, some of them were hyper traditionalists. They say, he's writing in free verse. How can we trust him? And when he uses poetic forms, he's making them operate a little differently than tradition did. Because tradition is not a set of unbreakable rules. Tradition is a kind of animating wisdom which guides you into forms of expression that work with human beings. And they'll change as times change. They'll change from author to author because the sensibility of one writer is different from another. And so I don't think you're embracing tradition if you look on it as something that's dead. It's alive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when Schiller wrote his great tragedies, and Schiller, to my taste, is the last great proponent of poetic tragedy. There's been individual successes since his. I mean, Robinson Jeffers' Medea is a great play, but you don't have anybody making a sustained career of great poetic dramas after Schiller. The other ones are single successes. I mean, Orazio by de Musset, would be one. Things like this, and so But Schiller's tragedies are not like Greek tragedies. They're not like Shakespearean tragedies. Even when he's trying to imitate Shakespeare, they're not like Shakespeare tragedies. They are recognizably the work of the German Enlightenment and early German Romanticism, the concerns of that age, of that sensibility. So, uh, I look on tradition as a dynamic force because if you believe it's a conversation, you got to keep the conversation fresh and you don't lose people. You don't have people check, sort of drift out of the conversations because it's so very boring.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, forms evolve, right? Last I checked, I don't think Schiller's Maria Stuart had a bunch of dancing girls from, like some Greek tragedy or something, right? Or you had like the Owless or or the Lyre even, right? So, we have this idea as well.
You
Greece,
know, tell something about how good Schiller's plays were, and that all the great opera composers of his age, Verdi, Donizetti,
right?
just set him to music, because he was so powerful.
Right. And I mean, I think this gets to even today in terms of the creative vitality of our culture. We could go even further that Schubert, Schumann, Beethoven, they loved Schiller, right? They loved Goethe. They really imbibed that their poetry. And so we could go further, right? When we think of musical composition, you have similar problems. We still see, you go on Twitter or something, you're going to see this virtuoso 5-year-old, God bless, and it's great, and they have talent. But then when you get to the composition question, how many of these virtuosos, right? Or it seems like virtuosity is the best that we can get today. But when it comes to original compositions, that's a lot rarer. But back in those days, right, they were reading Schiller. There was a certain culture of poetics, right, an appreciation for poetry that seemed to spill over, right,
Our music
into the other domains.
right now, I mean, we are at the tail end, the arteriosclerotic end of 100-year experiment in Western music, which was initiated by Arnold Schoenberg, who said that tonality had been exhausted. And he had a lot of reasons for saying that because the music that was being created around him in Vienna, some of it was great, but some of it was just meandering, chromatic music. There was no the tonality was being pushed to its breaking point. Now, what happens usually in arts like that is they then simplify. Uh, and you see this again and again and again. You go back to some fundamental thing. That's what tradition does. But what Schoenberg did was to say, well, I'm going to propose an alternative system.
Hmm.
And he created 12-tone music, which is a mathematical theory of an alternate tonality, a way of organizing atonality, as it were. It was a fascinating system. He immediately surrounded himself by acolytes, and at least one of which, uh, Berg, was a relatively, great composer. He died, quite young. Uh, but Wojciech, his violin concerto, are interesting works. But it went all across Europe, and then as those Germans fled Hitler, it came into the American systems, and it became the orthodoxy of academic music. And it's only been was still firmly in control. When I was a student back in the '60s, now it seems pretty much dead everywhere. But the next generation, where they had with Pierre Boulez, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Luciano Berio, these people, they created total serialism, which is a way of organizing dynamics and orchestration, and it was dead.
Hmm.
It was a subsidized academic theory, but it corrupted, I think, 2 or 3 generations of composers. They're still trying to get out of it. Uh, there are some great composers alive right now, and we should honor them. In America, we have Morton Lauridsen. In England, we have Sir James Macmillan. In Europe, we have Arvo Pärt. These are composers of majesty, but they, each in his own way, have had to reinvent uh, an idiom for serious music. And you have the minimalist movement in the United States, which has a few enormous successes. Uh, and so people are trying, in a sense, to reconceive, but uh, they more likely are to find inspiration in popular music or in pre-modernist music and find a way of doing it. Hertz, went back to medieval music and early Renaissance music. Macmillan went back into Renaissance polyphony. Uh, Morton Lawrenson, uh, this American composer, great composer. Listen to his Lux Aeterna. He writes very little. He, in a weird way, took uh, the entire history of choral music, kind of recapitulated it, and even brought in a kind of American, uh, think of American Broadway, the notion of an extended melodic line. And he created things, but all of them were people who worked against the mainstream. But see, one of the things I like about the Germans, uh, especially the 18th and 19th century Germans, is they had a vision of the totality of culture. Uh, our British poets and our American poets did not have a great musical tradition that was available to them. It would have been inconceivable for Coleridge to write an opera because there just was no English language opera in the sense that he would have needed. But for Germans, you have the tradition of Lieder. The greatest poems in the German language have been turned into the great art songs of the German language. You've got this poetic tradition that's expressed in choral music and in opera. In Brahms sets Schiller to music, Mahler sets Goethe to music. And so you have this interconnection. You have these painters that are operating of this. And I think it's a sign of a healthy culture when artists work across disciplines seriously, with their contemporaries. Certainly, one of the great pleasures of my creative career has been to work with musicians, and occasionally visual artists and choreographers and filmmakers, but mostly with musicians, which is an art I understand from the inside. I think one of the reasons that I maintained my sanity in the poetry world, there are people who perhaps disagree with that self-assessment, but the reason that I had some healthy perspective was that I was trained in music. And there's just certain commonsensical things that musicians learn. When you go to a group of musicians, within 5 minutes who the good musicians are. That guy's a terrific pianist. Oh my God, that bass player is weak. Oh, the saxophonist is great. The trumpeter is not. And those people have the ability to realize their imaginative intentions, and the other people hold you back, or other people are going to be at a very basic level of expression. And it says, in order to be I don't know if you know this about jazz musicians. If I'm the leader, say I'm a pianist, and I hire you as a drummer, saxophonist, a bass player, what I say is, my funny Valentine in D. And I just start playing. And I trust that that song so well, the changes, the rhythm of that song so well, that I don't have to teach you the chord structure, the changes, and you can shift it immediately into another key without thinking and hit the ground running. That presupposes enormous preparation, practice, and immersion in the tradition. A jazz musician will know 200-300 songs. They'll know the melodies, the chord changes, the tempi, and that has to happen before you even begin to think of yourself as an expressive artist. And I believe it's the same thing with poets. I think that we need to immerse ourselves in the tradition, master the techniques, and it's only then that we're able to be ourselves, to have self-expression possible or meaningful self-expression possible.
Yeah, for sure. And you know what's funny? Actually, I forget how old I was, maybe 24, 25. Leader was the thing. There was like a 6 month period where, yeah, also all sorts of things were changing in my life and whatnot. And I was just listening to Leader, and I had the texts, a lot of Schubert and a lot of Schumann, and I had the texts, and I was listening along. And it was just those simple little strophic poems and the immense beauty that, a Schubert, a Schumann, and others were able to create with just these simple lines and sort of developing their themes. That's where it clicked for me. This relationship between music and poetry, because it's so transparent with German Lieder. It's quite miraculous. And there's a simplicity to it. At the same time, it can be very complex. They're songs, right? They're not symphonies. The songs can be like a minute and a half, right? 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
I imagine that you, as I did, learned German through songs.
Yeah.
I studied German, but I would listen to Schubert and Schumann, and Brahms, uh, and the I would hear not just the language spoken, I'd hear it sung. I hear the soul of the language. See, German has the advantage. Now, this is a generalization, and people that know German literature will immediately point out some exceptions. But in general, German is the only language I know in which the poetry is easier to read than the prose.
Mm.
Uh, German prose, especially once you get into the late 19th century, is a formidable thing. But the poetry, and I think it's because it never cut itself off from song entirely, is much more immediate. And so, someone with a relatively small amount of German can read Goethe's early poems with complete comprehension. And that's a gift. It was a gift to me, at least. But I long for that relationship between poetry and music that existed in Germany in the 19th century, existed in a different way in Italy. But Italy is a dramatic tradition through opera rather than the songs are minor affairs compared to the greatness of German Lieder. But
Mm.
but a lot of times when I pick up a book of poems, before I just start reading it, I immediately, uh, how do I put this? I immediately sense how good the poet's technique is, which is not to say, can they write a sonnet or whatever? Is this a writer who can take the notion of a line and make the line meaningful, make the stanza meaningful, make the poem meaningful, whose choice of words, who creates a rhythm that's an intoxicating rhythm, whether it's a regular rhythm that's metrical or the rhythm of free verse, but somebody who essentially understands that in art, you have to shape everything in your medium for for an effect. Uh, and those things that you don't shape will have an impact whether you intend them to or not. And so I see a lot of poetry, which is okay, good. It's not bad, but it doesn't have the elan, the vital force
Mhm.
poetry should have. And that's what I'm writing about in poetry as enchantment. In this essay, I make many, many observations, but let me just start with one. And it's actually something I think you alluded to sideways, and one of the things that you said a few minutes ago, which is poetry has a relationship to magic. Uh, if you go back to Latin, the most common word that Romans used for song, for their poems, is this word Carmen. It's like the name Carmen, a Carmen. And a Carmen is a poem. It's also a song. It's also a magic spell. It's also a prophecy.
Mm.
So there was one word that the Romans used to refer to poetry, which has our modern sense of poetry, but also has a sense of a song, a magic spell.
I think of the word charm.
Yeah, and it comes into English as through French as charme, and then we say charms, uh, and we do have it in the original sense in English. We say, well, nurse, basically schoolyard charms, rain, rain, go away, come again some other day.
Mm.
Okay, what is that? That's a magic spell. You're saying by saying these words, I am invoking the rain to go away so I can go out and play, and now we don't believe it's an effective spell, but there's something ancient about that superstition. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, these rhymes, these charms, these schoolyard charms, these nursery spells uh, that we use that have a magical quality. And so, what does that lead us to say what a poem is? Well, a poem, in an ancient sense, is a musical formulation of language. It's speech raised to the level of song so that you can enchant the listener. Think of the word enchant. It has the word chant, which is from singing, from chanting, chanson, uh, canzone, these songs. And so if you use language in a certain musical way, it has the power to enchant the listener, uh, which has a magic effect. Now, no one believes that you're going to turn straw into gold, uh, with a poem. But I offer, what is an elegy? An elegy is a consolation that I write to help you overcome loss. What is a love poem? It's a poem. It's a set of words that is chanted so that my love is returned. And if you think of it this way, uh, even today, poetry has an implicit magical ambition. Not in because in traditional magic, by saying certain words in a certain order, you could change the nature of physical reality.
Mhm.
But poetry is trying to change the nature of psychic reality. Uh, and so it's a magical language that exists within uh, our own language. Now, if you talk to linguists, the first thing that they'll tell you, and the last thing they tell you, in fact, they'll never stop telling you because it's necessary, is that the English language is not what you find in a book. It's what we speak. It's this great web, it's of speech that sets the norms. And the norms change a bit. The meanings of words change a bit from generation to generation. And we have different ways of taking the great ocean of speech in which we swim and shaping it into other things. The two most common traditional ways that we shape it is verse and prose, which is to say, we take our speech, this language that's, we never stop talking, and we shape it for musical ends or for rhetorical ends.
Mhm.
I would argue that most of the poetry I read nowadays is kind of low order rhetoric. There's almost no musical no musicality that's intrinsic to it. No musical effect is much created. It's largely shaping it as a piece of of rhetoric with figurative language. But I think that you go there and what Plato, so notoriously is warning people about in terms of poetry is not, uh, you know, reading poetry and what we think of as, but the Dionysian effect that poetry had back in the Greek culture when it was sung and danced.
Mm.
They would have these, the equivalent of rock concerts where these choruses of young girls would come and dance and sing these hymns or these songs that were created for them by poets. The way that Greek poets spent most of their career was writing poems to be performed by young men and young women in competition in religious festivals. That
Mm.
was the bread and butter of Greek poets. And so what I think Plato is seeing is how powerful uh, these things where the whole community would get together and see all these competing groups of uh, of young people perform these intoxicating poems. It was like going to a rock concert or we used to have in my day the Battle of the Bands, where
Right.
different bands competition, or in America these shows that are I think drivel in one hand, but uh, they have a poetic power. Dancing with the Stars, American Idol, these things where people perform in competition, and so uh, when all of that energy leaves high culture and goes, and it's only resides in popular culture, and what we're left with is a kind of denatured uh, uh, elite discourse, which a lot of poetry is. Then poetry doesn't matter. Uh, but as soon as you hear a good poem, and I when I was the poet laureate of California, I went to all 58 counties of California. California is the size of a small Western European country, and it has everything from desert, high mountains, uh, hot, fertile farmlands, big cities, and coastal rainforests and the Pacific Ocean. It's radically different landscapes. It's the largest agricultural state in the U.S. Uh, and so I would go from community to community, most of which were small farm towns, mountain towns, desert towns. I would get together with local writers everywhere I went, and we'd have do readings and performances. I had high school kids that were part of a competition I helped create when I was chairman of the NEA called Poetry Out Loud. Teenagers, high school students memorize and recite poems in competition. Uh, and we would do these things, and I never went anywhere, didn't go anywhere where an audience was not struck by a good poem.
Mm.
These were some of these audiences were very educated. Some were completely they were farm workers. They were uh, recent immigrants from Latin America. But the response to poetry may not be universal, but it's nearly universal. And that's why we don't know any culture in the world which has not, on their own, developed poetry as part of their society.
Right. And I mean, one of the words that came to mind as well between this question of magic and music, you spoke about in a poetry's enchantment, the idea that poetry puts people in a light trance state, which we could say is true of a lot of different kinds of arts, technically, including modern cinema, right? And there's an interesting. I read a great book once. It's called title was Transformations, but trance dash formation. And I mean, this was a study, or this was based on studies, I should say. This particular book wasn't, but it was based on studies of previous researchers that were studying, for example, archaic shamanism and various tribal leftover tribal communities, right? Whether it's in Australia, Africa, wherever, and just studying the rituals, right? And whether it was going to see the witch doctor, right, to sort of free you from some demon spirit that was making you ill or something else. The whole idea was that for there to be some uh, for the real behavior change would happen under these heightened conditions of dance and song and music, where from a technical standpoint today, right, it's just recognized that you can elicit different trance states. I mean, even the bongos, right? People still today, people go crazy with the bongos, right? They throw in some ayahuasca or whatnot now, and I mean, this is not new, right? People think they're a part of some revolution or something. But so you've talked about that relation of trance and shamanism. And so I do think of this question of transformation, right? And the role that art plays in the transformation of culture, right? Whether it's poetry, whether it's music, and that this state, right, which is not critical, analytical thinking, but it's not just purely it's not just emoting.
Yeah,
If done well, this transformation state, I mean, that's one of the true powers that I think is understood by anybody who's thinking about how a society is governed, how a society works. And you do, if you don't want things to uh, go in a direction that, you don't want, you can't let this whole trance and this world of art just do what it wants. And so, I mean, it's powerful. So this idea of trance, I mean, you bring this up. It's something that, again, if people are thinking about just writing a modern free verse style poem, it could still be free verse and do trance, but that has that transformative effect that great art
they,
has.
they can work in many styles. I think it's more difficult to write a poem in free verse which has powerful enchantment in it. Not impossible. I can show you examples of how it's of people who have done it, but you have to, in a sense, develop your own system uh, versus borrowing some of the strength from tradition in doing that. But I want to go back to something you said at the beginning, which is talking about shamanism, about medicine. There's no way that we can go back and put on, animal masks and beat on a drum, uh, and have that represent an authentic form of uh, literary creation. Uh, it worked in its own time, and this was very big with people like Robert Bly in the 70s in the United States, these poets that wanted to go back to a shamanistic thing. But there was wisdom in these shamans. And in fact, when modern medicine goes back and studies or observes in current people what they're doing, there's a sophisticated kind of healing ritual that's going on, which is a form of rhythm, because they're always beating drums or playing certain things at a pace that that reflects one of your body rhythms, and it accelerates or it slows that particular body rhythm. Uh, and curiously, those things often prove very effective in dealing with the medical issue they are addressing. I mean, they're not as good as a modern research hospital, but it's not an empty kind of witchery. It's actually through the technology of a relatively limited society is not an ineffective way of treating people, of easing pain, of reducing tension, of
Mm.
improving blood flow and things like that. And that's curious because what it says is that uh, all human beings, wherever they are, have observed things about reality, have developed them into artistic or scientific systems, and there's some truth at the center of them. The truth I think that's most interesting about poetry, if you think about, you know, young choruses chanting and dancing poems, you think of Roman poets. probably by contemporary standards, half singing their poems, chanting their poems, where the quantities of the language, uh, possibly with the accompaniment of a flute or a lyre. But it's even if it's simply the voice, it is performative. That what we're reacting to in poetry is not what people at Yale and Princeton think, which is what they're trained to do, which is to look at words on a page as a conceptual statement that is open to conceptual investigation and commentary. And indeed, you can find out wonderful things uh, about a poem by conceptual analysis. But the real nature of a poem isn't open to that, because then the real nature of a poem is that it communicates to you holistically. It addresses you simultaneously as a person who thinks, who feels, who remembers, who intuits, who imagines, and most importantly, has a physical body with five senses. It a poem, poetic language speaks to you in the fullness of your embodied humanity, and this is the important uh, caveat. And it does not ask you to divide yourself. That it says all of these things are operating simultaneously in you. And poetry, which only addresses your intellect, is no better than a poem that only addresses your ear or your physical rhythms. You know, just the beating of a drum.
Mhm.
And so, I think contemporary literary life is very embarrassed by the human body. Uh, it's embarrassed by the sounds and that the body produces. I could say the same thing to you in three or four ways, and it means something different because of the way that I intone it, the
Mm.
way that I put accents in it. And so what poets have done is to find a way of taking spoken and written language and encoding it through meter, through uh, through other figures of speech, to embody all of the meanings that we would be able to achieve by singing it, dancing it, intoning it.
Mm.
Uh, and that is modern poetic technique. Now, personally, I long for the old days when you go from town to town, working with youth troops and doing it in competition. It was a very lively culture. Competition does tend to bring out individual excellence.
Mm.
We've lost most of this stuff, and we've lost all the music and all the dance steps. But I imagine it was something rather spectacular for its time. We can still, luckily, we've got what about uh, somewhere between 30 and 40 more or less intact uh, Greek tragedies that have survived. So we've got a very good sense of how splendid the Athenian drama was at the Greater Dionysian Festival. But
Right.
that's just one aspect of extremely rich ancient Greek culture. We're lucky because the Italians decided to reinvent Greek tragedy in 1599, and this shows you how tradition operates. They did their very best simply to replicate what the Greeks did, and as a consequence, they invented a new art form which we call opera.
Mm.
Uh, because real artists will take tradition and it'll form a new expression that's suitable for the age in which they live.
Right. And that makes perfect sense. I mean, this is where creativity comes in as well, right? And recognition of the uniqueness of each language culture, right? I mean, Italian has these nice open vowels, which are, right, it's just great for singing, right? Projecting the voice. I mean, ancient Greek had those nice long and short vowels as well. So yeah, that works wonders compared to say English, right? But all the more,
And but then and within 100 years, this early Italian opera developed itself into something everyone in the world at that point couldn't get enough of. But our language has its unique beauties. We
Yeah, no, I was gonna say like Shakespeare is not, performed to a lyre, but I mean the musicality of, Shakespeare's sonnets. I mean they don't need music, the way I see it. They have so
but yeah, but the idea people say, well, German's an ugly guttural language. I think it's a beautiful language, and certainly the musical settings of German poetry and lieder, choral music and opera. Uh, you couldn't imagine anything more beautiful. But the the national quality of music reflects the language itself in the way that you know American popular song and musical theater has. But the question really is that we're going around and saying, well, what does a poet do today?
mm,
And I would say that, I mean, I think, I'm sure there's somebody listening to me and just saying, good God, that Gioia is unbearable. He's just full of himself. And you might indeed be true. No one is a very good judge of oneself. But, I've always had this basic notion that if you live in a confused age, and I believe we live in a deeply confused age, and I think in some cases, the more education people have, the more complicated their confusions become. Uh, Not that education is a bad thing, and not that complexity is a bad thing, but you live in a confused age, and you want to be an artist. You Before you can really create, you've got to think through some fundamental issues. What is it you're trying to create? Who are you creating it for?
mm,
What if you don't believe in tradition, what genre? I mean, it's certainly funny. I have these poets that don't uh, believe in tradition, but when they talk about their work, they talk about it uh, in commercial categories.
mm,
As if they're recording popular music. Well, it's not this category, it's not that category. So they're just looking, putting tradition in a different, I think, less accurate way of gauging it. But the first thing you've got to do is just to figure out, what are the fundamentals of your art. And I think only then can you really begin. You don't have to write criticism. uh you and I, David, write criticism. It's in our nature, but I think in some ways we're doing it because we want to know where we're going as poets, or at least in my case, I needed to know where I wasn't going. uh, that most of the poetry that was being created around me in the late '60s and in the '70s, I just did not think was very good. Uh, and yet I believe that you could still write wonderful poetry, and every now and then I came across a poet who was writing terrific poetry. But I just needed to figure out what the landscape was and where I was in there, where I wanted to go, what was the road I wanted to go down. And so I think that, like it or not, critics uh, help creative writers and help determine what they're doing, and also help readers understand what's being written. Uh, and then the other thing is that if you're writing poetry, you know, you've you've got to do at least as good a job, as a bad carpenter would. You can't,
mm.
you got to know how to, frame a house, how to build something that isn't going to collapse on you while you're working in it. Um, and so you can say it's craftsmanship. I tend to think it's tradition. And let me put it this way. When I say the word tradition, literary tradition, artistic tradition, uh, what they summon up to most people is an old marble building, a museum,
Mhm.
concert hall, or maybe it's an early modernist glass and steel building or something like this. But tradition is not a public building. Tradition is a love affair. Tradition is a passion. And if you're really in love with someone, There's going to be a lot of wear and tear. There's going to be a lot of energy that you have to invest in that. But what you'll find that love transforms you. It expands who you are. It allows you to see things and understand things that you didn't before you had this love, and it takes you to places that, in some cases, you might not even have imagined. It takes you to places where you see yourself in ways that you were not able to. And so, what I would encourage the writers who are listening to this is to, you know, read a few good critics, get some sense of where you are in the complicated uh, present moment of literature, and then leap into a passionate, even potentially destructive love affair,
Mm.
art that you're practicing, uh, and make yourself open to its pleasures, its pains, and its transformations.
Amen. And I mean, we could keep going for a while at this point, but we do want to hear some of your poems, which I think are perfect model. I mean, I think they're a perfect model. You're the poems do everything you've been talking about, so we do want to get some performative and living examples of that. I was taken by your poetry from the first time I read it. I said, okay, this guy's I mean, he knows what
Is
he's
there,
doing, and yeah.
is there one you'd like me to read, or do you want me to pick something? Or
There are a few. I mean, I picked out a few that I'd like, but I mean, also just based on our conversation, if there's something that
title?
sticks out, I have a few ideas otherwise, but
Give me a couple of titles, and let me see if I can. If one of them seems.
I mean, we're almost at that time of year. I really love prayer at solstice. Maybe we can, I don't know if we want to start with that one, but that is a great one, which I think also, maybe we can talk about this after, but we talked about the connection between poetry and song, connection between poetry and prayer. It's also a very interesting question, and I think that poem really brings that to the surface. Maybe let's ease in a bit. So your
So,
opening poem.
okay, well, I'll begin with Prayer Winter Solstice.
Okay.
Um, um, this is a poem. It has 14 lines. I don't, uh, I didn't conceive of it as a sonnet, but as I was finishing it, I thought that was a good length. And what it is, technically, I didn't even know the name of that, although is a doxology, a beatitude. It's praising and blessing something. So it's winter solstice is coming up right now. Actually, my birthday is usually, I was born on Christmas Eve, so I'm born,
Mm.
you know, near the solstice. In fact, the traditional day for Christ's birth is related to the solstice. We'd have no idea what time of year Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but the mythic imagination needed it to be at the darkest and bleakest time of the year because that's when the world needs redemption. So this is a poem of praise and blessing, prayer at winter solstice. Blessed is the road that keeps us homeless. Blessed is the mountain that blocks our way. Blessed are hunger and thirst, loneliness, and all forms of desire. Blessed is the labor that exhausts us without end. Blessed are the night and the darkness that blind us. Blessed is the cold that teaches us to feel. Blessed are the cat, the child, the cricket, and the crow. Blessed is the hawk devouring the hare. Blessed are the sinner and the saint who redeem each other. Blessed are the dead, calm in their perfection. Blessed is the pain that humbles us. Blessed is the distance that bars our joy. Blessed is this shortest day that makes us long for light. Blessed is the love that in losing we discover.
That's
Now
great.
that's
And
in free verse, but I balance the absence of meter with a syntactic structure, the repetition, of blessed, which is in the tradition of Beatitudes. Uh, I work in paradoxical statements, so you find other ways of intensifying the language. But I'm glad you like that poem. I love the poem, but I think it has a dark wisdom that does not appeal to everyone.
I mean, there are so many good things that I could say about this poem. And we do want to read a few, so we
We'll
could
keep
do it.
going. We don't need commentary.
No, but one thing, I mean, yeah, it's this is definitely an example of having you're engaged with a tradition here. I mean, this is the Sermon on the Mount. This is the Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount, and at the same time, you do something different, and there are a lot of, I guess you could call them inversions in terms of, I mean, or paradoxes, yeah. And it's just a series of paradoxes and going through them, but we can meditate on each of these for a long time. And that's what I like. This is something that we can really ruminate on and chew on. And I think that's what a great poem at the end of the day, you want to remember it, right? You've talked a lot about Frost and such, as I have. And yeah, the idea of remembrance, it, as you've repeated, and I like to now repeat as well, poetry reminds us of those things that it would impoverish us to forget. And yeah, this has a lot of nice reminders. So beautiful. Uh,
What
you,
else would you
I like this is the opening poem. You're free to, I mean, say any uh, prefatory comments or not. Burning Ladder. It's the first poem in your collection of 99 poems. So you put it right up front there. That's a great
Yeah,
one.
it's actually probably the earliest poem in the selected poems. Now, I have to tell people that this is a poem that once again is written in free verse, but I have done a visual arrangement of the words on the page, the way that they line up, which I think creates a kind of rhythm in the poem. Uh, that it wouldn't have if you printed it flat as prose. I'm of course referring to the episode in Genesis where Jacob, who's coming to the desert, uh, falls asleep. He, uses a stone as a pillow, and he has a vision. You could say it's a dream, but it's I think more truly a vision of this ladder uh, that connects heaven and earth, and he sees the sons of God, the angels, coming up and down between heaven and earth. He also, just a little later, wrestles with one of the angels, but at this point, this is the vision. The burning ladder. Jacob never climbed the ladder burning in his dream. Sleep pressed him like a stone in the dust, and when he should have risen like a flame to join that choir, he was sick of traveling and closed his eyes to the seraphim ascending, unconscious of the impossible distances between their steps. Missed them mount the brilliant ladder, slowly disappearing into the scattered light between the stars, slept slept through it all, a stone upon a stone pillow, shivering, gravity always greater than desire. Uh, you'll excuse me, there's rumbling at my door. It's my cat, I think, who wants in.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah, go ahead. Let the
I
can
apologize
come
for
in.
the audience, but the cat-like noises that my cat Chekhov will make. Uh, Edgar Allan Poe had a raven tapping at his chamber door. I have an orange cat
Oh,
who's
the
in
orange
there.
cats. Love the
So
orange.
I've opened just enough so he can open it up with his paws. You want to do another poem?
Yeah,
Should
sure.
I try
You
a
want to let him
rhyme?
in? Did you want to go let the cat in?
No, I just opened the door. He can
Oh,
sort of.
okay. Yeah, let's do one more here. I mean, I see it's what's funny though is with these last two poems you pointed out, they're technically free verse, but there's a lot of form here in terms of the idea, the development of the ideas and the musical development, and there are patterns and that sort of helps for the ideas to unfold. So yeah, I feel it's like, yeah, it's hard to call them free verse. They're really just they're poems. They've
They're unmetered. They're free. I think there's an avant-garde writer I know, Richard Castellanets. And Richard is. I mean, you could not get more avant-garde than him. I mean, he's on in a different dimension from me. But he believes that you cannot have poetry, you cannot have literature without some form, without some constraints, some rules. And so you just change them. And in fact, one of the things I'm proud about my work, but I think it's actually something that makes conventional academic critics uneasy, is that I work in every possible form the English language offers pretty much. And I love having a new tune to sing in a poem. And so I just did my stanza patterns, or I differ, the way I use rhyme. I like both regular rhyme and irregular rhyme. I use stressed meters, conventional meters, and I like to have the poem to play with the noises that words make.
mm,
Um, and the same way that when I was a young musician, never was in percussion, but if I came into like a orchestral room or whatever, there was a bunch of percussion instruments there. I played every one. I just wanted to hear what they sounded like.
mm.
So let's think of something with rhyme, just so
Yeah,
that
you choose.
have some evidence that all these attacks, this evil rhymester. Uh, how about the next poem? Do you like that poem at all? Or
The next poem, I don't know that I've I think I read. Go ahead. I have it in the
I
book
was thinking
here.
here, but this, uh, being a poet is a tough thing. I mean, it's that you you toil and you suffer, and you spend all this time writing a poem, and then the world ignores it. I mean, you have to be pretty tough uh, to be a poet.
Mm,
And but what keeps us going as poets is the hope, indeed the faith, that the next poem we write is going to be the great one.
mhm.
It's going to win us, fame, fortune, and the favors of the beautiful. Um, and so I've taken the liberty of describing my next poem uh, in a poem called The Next Poem. How much better it seems now than when it is finally done. The unforgettable first line, the cunning way the stanzas run, the rhymes, soft spoken and suggestive, are barely audible at first, an appetite not yet acknowledged, like the inklings of a thirst, while gradually the form appears, as each line is coaxed aloud, the architecture of a room, seen from the middle of a crowd. The music, that of common speech, but slanted so that each detail sounds unexpected as a sharp inserted in a simple scale. No jumble box of imagery dumped glumly on the reader's lap, or elegantly packaged junk the unsuspecting must unwrap, but words that could direct a friend precisely to an unknown place, those few unshakable details that no confusion can erase, and the real subject left unspoken, but unmistakable to those who don't expect a jungle parrot in the black and white of prose. How much better it seems now than when it is finally written. How hungrily one waits to feel the bright lure seized, the old hook bitten.
Hmm. That's fun. That's great.
Yeah, I like it. I think poems should be, it's not a bad thing for a poem to be witty. You want to do one more before we call it a
Yeah.
night?
Yeah.
And would you like? Uh,
Let's see here. I mean, there are a lot. Um, I I mean, we could go. I like the Lost Garden, Cruising with the Beach Boys. I mean, these are all fun. The road is
road is short, since
yeah,
we're
go.
probably running over
Yeah.
time.
Let's. I mean, you
I'll,
can choose.
I'll be happy to read all night until your audience one by one drops, in a torpor from
No, I
exhaustion
mean
or
this is great. It's good to hear you read your
uh,
poems.
I think
I'd say you do us. Yeah, you know your poetry better than I do. I mean, what is choose something that you would like to close with, and
uh, let me well, I closed my book. You asked me to read the poem that I began it with, which was The Burning Ladder. This is a love poem to my wife. And I don't write deeply autobiographical poems. My poems are all personal, but I don't try to chronicle the the details of my existence. Excuse me, one moment. My cat is chewing on my computer
no
cord.
worries.
Uh,
Cat gets what cat wants.
he, uh, I often will sit down at my keyboard and discover nothing works, and after about 10 minutes of trying this, that, and the other, I discovered that some mysterious force has chewed through some wire. Uh, he's going to electrocute himself. But I love him, and I actually love him being annoying. It makes life more interesting. So I wanted to write a poem to my wife, uh, and in the volume with it. And it's about two things. The first thing that it's about is that what really deep love is, deep sexual love, is mostly a conversation. It's a palaver, it's a patois. You uh, you have a conversation with somebody that goes on your whole life, and you're in love with somebody when anything that happens to you is not entirely real until you tell the other person, until you take the story of your life and you wrap it around theirs so that they're constantly intertwining. The
Mm.
second is that you create this private language together, and it's the most intimate form of communication that you'll ever have with anybody in the world, but it's doomed because eventually one of you is going to be gone. I mean, you can be gone because a relationship breaks up, but if you it's a lifelong love, one of you will die. And then suddenly the only other native speaker of this language is gone. And that makes you say, well, is it worthwhile? And that's what this poem is this the great human effort of erotic intimacy. Is it a worthy project? And I have as a metaphor in the back of this, and I think a Canadian will understand this, but not as with as much poignancy perhaps as a Californian. In California, there are a number of Indian tribes in which there are only one or two people left who speak the language, who know the songs, who know the dances. And when they go, in some ways, part of the spirit of the tribe goes. Uh, and I use that as a kind of, it's kind of an implicit metaphor. I never quite use it, but it's underneath as a metaphor for love. Marriage of many years. Most of what happens beyond words. The lexicon of lip and fingertip defies translation into common speech. I recognize the musk of your dark hair. It always thrills me, though I can't describe it. My finger on your thigh does not touch skin. It touches your skin, warming to my touch. You are a language I have learned by heart. This intimate patois will vanish with us. It's only native speakers. Does it matter? Our tribal chants, our dances round the fire performed the sorcery we most required. They bound us in a spell time could not break. Let the young vaunt their ecstasy. We keep our tribe of two in sovereign secrecy. What must be lost was never lost on us.
Hmm. That's nice.
And,
There's
and,
a lot of memorable, there's lines here that one wants to revisit. That's nice.
and I'll end with my own epitaph. Uh, a friend of mine and I had worked on had a literary press that he was doing, and I was his advisor. So we were involved in this for nearly 40 years. And then he's was shutting it down. So I said, well, why don't you make your last publication our two epitaphs?
Mm.
So I wrote mine. It's only 2 lines long, uh, and it's my for those of you who my name is Dana Gioia. And although Gioia sounds like it's a J because it's pronounced like a J, because there is no J in the Italian alphabet, so you have a GI. So my initials are DG. Here lies DG, a poet who can say he didn't even have an MFA.
Mm. Zing. No, that's great.
So anyway, I want you to end on a light note, I think, David, especially after, the ponderous issues we have discussed.
Yeah, no, and it was great to, it was great to go on a journey. I mean, again, there's so much that we'll still be able to, I'm sure, discuss in the future. But yeah, for tonight, Dana, thank you for giving your time here and having some fun with us. And so I will thank you. I will thank our listeners, and we'll be back next week.